Hi everyone. After I recorded this episode, which I really like, I had an important and rather embarrassing realization about it, which I don't really like. So please listen through to the end after Luna's bark, and you'll hear my penance and my solution. Hi everyone, and welcome to Be True, my podcast about the writing I love and the writing I do. I promise I won't rhyme the whole time. I'm John Tessitore, and today, a section from my long single poem chapbook, All the Lonely American Roads. You can find all the lonely American roads and all of my work at johntessitore.com. As I'm writing this episode, Jeff Bezos, the emperor of Amazon.com, has prevented the editorial team at the Washington Post from endorsing a presidential candidate for the first time in ages. The Washington Post, as you know, is one of the few storied American newspapers that has survived the digital age with its dignity nearly intact. And Bezos now owns it. After a few days of silence, Bezos has just issued a statement in which he justifies his decision by claiming two things. One, endorsements don't change votes, and two, endorsements look like bias. Now, far be it from me to defend the American media in 2024, which has nearly destroyed itself in order to avoid its job, which is to present the facts of the day. The facts of the day, that is, the actual things that are happening around us and the reasons why, are complicated, and messy, and contradictory, and impossible to control. As Al Gore once said, the truth is inconvenient. Traditionally, it has been the job of journalists to live in that inconvenience for us. That's why we pay them. Except that we don't pay them. Jeff Bezos and Rupert Murdoch pay them. And increasingly, assholes like Elon Musk pay them. Corporate animals. And corporate animals, by definition, choose convenience over inconvenience, and the path of least resistance. By definition. Least resistance is the very definition of the corporation, and I mean that literally. As a result, the news media has come to treat every stupid soundbite from every shiny human, thoughtful or thoughtless, as if they were equal, and every political candidate, the qualified and the unqualified alike, equally. They've both sides issues that have only one side. They've treated people by different standards simply to make sure they avoid the accusation of bias, and instead of living in the inconvenience for us, they have made us all dumber. And by dumber, I mean beholden to Jeff Bezos, whose self-justification, issued as I write this podcast, whose reasons for shutting down the Washington Post's presidential endorsement reveals two things about him and about corporations more generally. For Bezos, the truth is important only if it has practical value, so presumably he'd have allowed the paper to endorse Kamala Harris if he had evidence that the endorsement actually influenced votes. And two, he believes that research, thought, study, the weighing of options, the best rational process for making decisions, looks like bias if it offends public opinion, which is utter horseshit, but corporate horseshit at its best. Now, why does a guy doing a poetry podcast give a damn about a newspaper squabble and a useless endorsement? It's because I have a commitment to an impractical pursuit of some kind of truth. I have no special access to truth, but I have a commitment to a process. I write something, I edit it, I smack it around until it feels like it reveals something, I revise like a lunatic. If I still don't like it, I come back later, or I write a new version of the idea, or a different expression of it, until it rings true to me. And if it rings false later, I shove it in the reject folder, and I write something else. And if it rings true, I publish and wait for the response. And the most important response is true or not true. I like it or I don't like it comes later. True or not true comes first, hence the name of my podcast, Be True. It's the same process that newspapers follow, or should, in their articles and in their editorials. It's not a perfect process, but it's a process of trying to figure out the world, in my case, figuring out the world for myself first, and then, if all goes well, for someone else too. For you even. And this process comes with a set of beliefs. Number one, weighing evidence and making choices before writing something, for example, is not bias. It is responsibility. Number two, seeking facts in a noisy world is not bias. It is science. Number three, Setting aside our immediate needs for the needs of others is not bias, it is morality. And 4, speaking truth to power is not bias, it is obligation. It's a very internal process to begin with. Truth, when I start writing, is truth for me. It's my own self-examination. But truth for you, too, is the ultimate goal. I'm not a journalist, at least not when I'm writing poems or recording this podcast. But I have been a journalist in the past. In fact, I once interviewed Jeff Bezos, which is a story for another time. But the basic commitment is the same. Look deep, try to find the important information and the facts, and present them as clearly as you can. And then accept the consequences. Anything less, exaggeration, falsification, manufactured controversy, fear, is nihilism. It's intellectual gamesmanship. It's a poison we've been forced to drink. It can look a little like freedom sometimes. A good lie can be a dopamine rush, especially if you get away with it. But it's nihilism, and it plays right into the hands of power, and right into the hands of the corporation. How easy is it to sell every goddamn thing in the world on Amazon.com if there are no rules and nothing really matters? So we need things like newspaper editorials, not because they sway votes, but because they help set the terms. They help us separate fact from fiction and mark the territory. Just like we need poems and novels and music and paintings and sculpture and dance, not because they sell shit or give us a definitive truth or give us quantifiable results of any kind, but because they give us markers about where we were, where we are, and where we might go. When I wrote the short poetic passage I'm about to read, I believe I was thinking about the tendency of intellectuals to over-intellectualize. I was an academic at one point, as you may remember, and I saw the tendency firsthand, even in myself, to treat current events intellectually, impersonally, like phenomena to be studied. There's a distance in that tendency, a distance that is sometimes necessary, but that makes me uncomfortable too. A distance in which people become categories rather than people. True enough. But at least the academic process is peer-reviewed. That's very important. Other scholars evaluate everything that is published in an academic journal or by an academic press, and the most ambitious scholars are miserable critics of each other. So the vetting tends to be pretty rigorous. What we are dealing with now, however, is something far more insidious. Not a distancing intellectualization, but a distancing nihilism. Not an impersonal dismissal, but an age in which nothing matters except the path of least resistance. So I hear this little passage a little differently today. What have we learned through endless study to prepare us for one moment of loss? What wisdom did they offer us? What we miss is never the practicum, but the reason for tying ourselves to the whipping post, lashing our brother's keeper, leaving one bad situation for another. For these, we have no answer. Try as we might. No explanation. But a meager profit is meager motivation. The truth is, no intellectual theory prepares us for one moment of loss. No one can explain death. There's always a distance. In poetry, we try our best, and the stakes for any individual poem are pretty low. But in politics, that distance has real repercussions, like the Dodd decision, or the constant threats of mass deportation, or the lies about people eating our cats and our dogs. Our politics today are as far from the way we live our day-to-day personal lives as they have ever been. That is, they're as distant as our entertainment. That's what prompted Michelle Obama's recent plea. I'm asking you all from the core of my being to take our lives seriously. Please. A meager profit is meager motivation. And so, in the hope that you pursue and try to hold on to the truth in a fucked up time, this is John Tessitore concluding another installment of Be True. If you've listened this long, thank you. You can find all of my work, including all the lonely American roads, at johntessitore.com. But first, vote. Special thanks to me for today's theme music, which I call F-Chord. Maybe we'll talk again, and if you enjoyed this little podcast, leave some stars or a review and support the work through the Ko-Fi account. ko-fi.com/John Tessitore. And tell your friends. In the meantime, I gotta feed the dog. All right, Luna, I'm coming. Okay, so I said at the start that I had a realization after I recorded this episode, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't have it first. Here it is. I publish all of my little books, and therefore the content of this very episode, using Kindle Direct Publishing. That's right, Amazon's self-publishing platform. And my books are available primarily on Amazon.com. Now, that's not unusual in the self-publishing universe. Amazon has the biggest distribution, and KDP is basically a frictionless platform. I find it very convenient to use. But shit, John. I mean, come on. Well, that's capitalism for you, poisoning everything. So here's what I'm going to do about it in the short term. I'm going to encourage you to shop for poetry where I shop for poetry, the Grolier Poetry Bookshop. If you're lucky enough to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you can find them at 6 Plimpton Street in Harvard Square. And if you're anywhere else, you can shop for almost any poetry book through their website, grolierpoetrybookshop.org, and they get a cut. This is not a paid advertisement. This is penance for my own stupidity. A free ad for my favorite independent bookstore, because Jeff Bezos sucks.